This is hell.
And neoliberalism is behind the rise of the far right, whether it's here in the United States with the Proud Boys or in Afghanistan with the Taliban or the Islamic State, wherever it happens to be. Neoliberalism has privatized nearly everything, including violence, which is increasingly conducted by non-state actors. And those non-state actors are not seeking real democracy. Instead, they demand a new form of fascistic dominance. Here to help us understand where the global culture war between capitalism and democracy stands and hopefully give us a better understanding of where it may be going, historian Suzanne Schneider is author of The Apocalypse and the End of History, Modern Jihad and the Crisis of Liberalism. Welcome to This Is Hell, Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Chuck. It's great to be with you.
You can follow Suzanne on Twitter at Suzy_Schneider. That's SUZY_Schneider. You start by writing that on November 14th, 1914, the chief jurist of the Ottoman Empire issued a fatwa declaring jihad on the empire's enemies. The empire had recently, if reluctantly, been pulled into the Great War on the side of the Central Powers and suddenly found itself at war with Britain and France, in addition to its historic rival, Russia. The circumstances surrounding the Ottoman Declaration were quite unusual. This was a holy war fought in alliance with major Christian powers. It was moreover a jihad made in Germany, in the words of one contemporary observer, eyeing the millions of Muslims living under British and French colonial rule. German Orientalists and administrators hoped that a declaration of jihad from the Sultan Caliph would stir the masses to revolt. In this regard, the scheme was an utter failure, having no measurable impact beyond the empire's boundaries, but it remains illustrative of the exotic quality Western observers have tended to ascribe to jihad, envisioning holy war as something apart from the quotidian mass slaughter taking place all around them. How is a holy war, in this sense jihad, how is that holy war different in any way from what you call quotidian mass slaughter? And if it is not different, why do Western observers view jihad differently?
So I think, one thing we have to kind of wrap our heads around to answer this question is that jihad is not the same thing throughout the ages. It's a, historical phenomenon that has changed radically. It has particularly changed radically over the last 100 years, as I chart in this book. And that the kind of fixation on holy war kind of clouds and obscures that. For most of Islamic history, jihad is simply the kind of Muslim way of warfare, and the extensive juridical literature that's devoted to it is somewhat dry. If you're looking for sensationalism, you might look elsewhere. It's, what types of weapons can be used, how places of worship should be guarded, what to do with kind of, members of the other side who have been captured, so on and so forth. And it's taken for granted within this literature that jihad is a tool of states and rulers. So I would kind of make a case for thinking about jihad simply as war, in kind of a parallel maybe to the way in which, medieval or early modern, thinkers were talking about war and just war theory and who has the ability to declare war in the Western world. These discussions are not that different. They obviously each have their own kind of cultural resonances, but I think that those have been amplified is part of an attempt to make jihad this like truly exotic thing that we can't possibly wrap our minds around. So I think some of the mystique falls away if you just think about jihad traditionally as war. It's a type of war that Muslims would wage and that Muslim rulers and states in particular would wage. What happens over the course of the 20th century, which I talk about, is that in kind of like formal legal terms, jihad goes from being a tool of states, that is war, to being something that is a insurgent tool or a revolutionary tool. So that's what we call terrorism, right? No longer directed by states, but often turned against them by people like Osama bin Laden, who does not have a state, who does not have an army to draft, who does not have any of the traditional credentials required to declare jihad. So the jihad that we encounter today is not the same thing as it was even 100 years ago, to say nothing of, 400 or 500 or 600 years ago or a millennia ago. And understanding the ways in which jihad became unmoored from the state over the last century, and particularly over the last 50 years, I think can teach us something really fundamental about this kind of reconfiguration of violence in the neoliberal age.
So you mentioned how bin Laden's organization, Al-Qaeda, it more closely resembled an NGO or a corporate entity. So when he delivers his fatwa, was that unprecedented? Until that time, had fatwas always been imbued with the power of the state?
Well, not necessarily with the power of the state, but the power of a kind of a recognized religious authority. Right. Certainly the power to declare jihad still kind of, I think, up until really Sayyid Qutb in the 1950s and 1960s is still kind of very clearly vested in the hands of the state. But, bin Laden has no credentials apart from like issuing a jihad. He has no credentials to kind of to issue, fatwas, Islamic legal judgments to begin with. Right. Like many of the figures in this world, his training is in, civil engineering and business administration. He's not a product of traditional Islamic learning, which is something that we see kind of across the ranks of the Islamists and kind of those who have kind of embraced jihad over the last, again, half century, is that, many of these people are not, and certainly the leaders of these circles are not kind of the products of traditional centers of Islamic learning. And that makes sense because the agenda that they are advancing is in many ways in really a direct challenge and confrontation to the kind of traditions of Sharia and to its practitioners.
And you point out that that on June 12, 2016, Omar Mateen, he opened fire in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, killing 49 people and injuring 53 more. 29 years old with a penchant for violence and in all likelihood an undiagnosed mental illness, not to mention turmoil stemming from his own conflicted sexuality. Mateen fit well into the pantheon of American mass shooters. Though this was the 133rd American mass shooting of 2016 alone, the mystical conception of jihad proved irresistible for commentators eager to differentiate homegrown white assailants from Muslim terrorists. Thus, Mateen was not a troubled young man like Adam Lanza or Devin Patrick Kelly, the perpetrators behind mass shootings at the Sandy Hook Elementary School and Sutherland Springs First Baptist Church, respectively, but rather a religious fanatic and had sworn allegiance to the Islamic State and its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Joining the jihad no longer required migrating to a safe harbor for training or coordinating with operatives online, as it might have a generation earlier, but was rather a wholly self-directed affair. All that was necessary was a target and a gun, which, this being America, were easily available. Has jihad become a kind of dog whistle within the U.S. media and popular parlance? And if it is, what is the dog whistle alerting its audience to, and who is its audience?
I mean, I think that this case of Mateen is was really illustrative in terms of like the media and kind of law enforcement responses to this. Right, there was all of this kind of, and the same thing happened, after the shooting in San Bernardino, kind of a few months prior, also by a couple who had sworn allegiance, to the Islamic State. That, depending, are we going to completely lose our shit over this, or are we going to just assimilate it into the everyday course of normal life, like another mass shooting, and really determining the motivations of the perpetrator? That is the key thing here. If we can see that they've sworn allegiance to the Islamic State, then suddenly this becomes a counterterrorism mission, that this becomes something that we will kind of sacrifice anything in order to protect against. But in the instance that it's just your run-of-the-mill mass shootings, that'll dominate the news cycle for a few days, and then we just kind of go back to business as usual. And I think that there's something really fascinating about these examples, because they really push at the that we really want to differentiate between quote unquote our violence and their violence. We really want to, have this idea that we have this clash of civilizations, and that people who engage in jihad come from this entirely different culture, and they're anti-modern, and they don't share our values, right? And all of that stuff. And then you find these instances where the boundary between our violence and their violence becomes really blurry. These are precisely the moments that I think, a certain elite class springs into motion to try to reassert this distinction, to reassert this division. No. These things have nothing alike, and that because it is actually a lot more troubling, I think, to have to regard this as a continuum, to say that it's not that, Omar Mateen is shooting up a kind of nightclub in Orlando because he is part of a, medieval Islamic community that's trying to resurge in the modern era, but because there's something kind of fundamentally rotten at the core of our modernity, and that modernity is shared, even if it's experienced differently in different places. So really trying to distinguish between our violence and their violence, I think, is a mode of system preservation for the West, for capital, to say, oh, no, don't look over here. Certainly none of these political and social crises stem from the world that we live in, that we inhabit, we have to assign that to something else. So yes, whether it's the medieval holdout, whether it's holy war and this kind of very exotic, variation, it's the Islamic world, it's something that has nothing to do with us. But we need to do that not only so we can kind of justify certain types of violence against, abroad and against Muslims at home, but also for, the sake of system preservation, of reassuring people that there's nothing fundamentally askew in the social and political order that we take for granted.
Is that unique to Islam, or do we feel that religion kind of lives in a vacuum off by itself and is unaffected by the world around it?
I mean, I think that broadly speaking, right, people tend to think of religions as these essential things that exist in the same shape and time over history, and that's simply not the case. They're historically embedded. They change and people fight about them, and that's not a weird thing. That is kind of constitutive of them. But I think that with regard to Islam, it's that kind of general, I would say, sloppiness in terms of a really lack of theoretical sophistication of how we think and talk about religion, is kind of taken to a fevered pitch, because we have this, particularly coming after 9/11, you have this whole, crew that will argue that Islam is not only is Islam a kind of an essentially a monolith, right, a singular thing that exists in without much diversity the world over, but it is tied to a particular type of violence and enmity against the West that has jihad as its mode of actualization. And so Islam is essentially violent in ways that other religions are not regarded as being, or in the ways that other religions maybe used to be, but they were vanquished by the Reformation, for instance, and now we've moved on to these more civilized times. So there is a way in which these kind of I would say fairly theoretical reflections about religion and whether or not they're singular entities, right? Can we talk about Islam at all in the singular? I don't think so. It'd be much better if we just talked about Muslims and recognize that some Muslims do some things and some Muslims do the opposite thing. But we don't have that level of sophistication in our discussion largely. And when you tie that to the notion that Islam, this thing, again, which we've defined as an abstract essence in the singular terms, is uniquely violent, it's essentially violent, you can't get away from it, then I think you set yourself up for justifying the type of imperial violence, again, abroad, and kind of, surveillance regimes at home that we've seen since 9/11.
So why the stress on and even the manufacturing of this idea of Islamic continuity? Is seeking continuity an inherent issue with the study of history, whatever that history is, just seeking the historical context, or is there more of a stress on continuity when it comes to Islamic history? Because I understand looking into Islamic history to trying to understand its contemporary nature. I understand trying to find that historical context. So is there more of a stress on continuity when it comes to viewing Islamic history?
I mean, right, I'm a historian. I certainly advise people to look into history to understand context. But the problem with the explanations about kind of contemporary jihad is not that they're trying to root this in history, but that they think that, right, you can explain the Islamic state by looking backward into what the Quran said or what the Hadith said, rather than looking sideways at the forms of violence that proliferate in our, contemporary society. And that seems to be a erroneous approach. Not because the history is unimportant, but as I kind of point out in the book, right, the Quran has existed in this form for 1400 years. Much of this medieval writing about, the apocalyptic traditions, again, have been with us for many hundreds of years. So explaining why these things take hold and are interpreted in the ways that they are and really like reseed themselves and take root at particular moments is not something we can just answer by recourse to theology, basically by looking backward. And so I do think that it's like necessary to know these things. But one of the things that again comes out by studying this history is not continuity, but rupture. That like looking into the history of jihad, you can see, oh yes, there's something fundamentally different here with what's happening in the 20th century, where jihad is no longer a tool of states, where it is directed against states. And in the case of the US, they're enablers, right? Where it is taken upon, where individuals take it upon themselves as something they can take part in vigilante style. Right, rather than being called up to jihad in the way that you would be conscripted for a war, suddenly they take it upon themselves as vigilantes to go and be, I don't know if we want to really get very close to home here, to be the forces of law and order. So that is, we can't just explain that by reading the Quran. We have to, understand the ways in which, religious ideology is really embedded in these material circumstances, and it's constantly refreshing itself. It's constantly innovating, even if it claims not to be doing so. Indeed, the claim that it's not innovating is itself like a very kind of mark of something wholly modern. So I think we have to, again, all for looking backward, but then sometimes what happens when we look backward is that we discover rupture, not continuity.
Yeah, and I was really fascinated by this because you talk about this way that they try to, stay relevant. And they are constantly innovating the religion. Religions are constantly changing. But at the same time, so many religions constantly are saying, we are the most authentic, pointing towards the past. So how can you both be innovating, changing your religion, and at the same time pretending, or at least claiming that you're part of the past? Isn't there a conflict there?
I mean, in logical terms, sure, but it's something that we see. It's something that it's incredibly common among kind of reactionary religious movements who claim that they're doing nothing other than the core principles as stated in the holy text, and it's been a very fruitful, I think, subject for scholars of religion to trace the ways in which those claims usually are, dissolve under any sort of scrutiny. Again, like truly traditional people do not walk around talking about how traditional they are. Like, this is a construct of the modern world itself that kind of comes out of, both wanting to deny that world on the one hand, but being unable to escape its logic on the other. And it becomes tied to various political and social projects, again, that are kind of incomprehensible outside of modernity.
You also point out that within the West, there are two primary views about Islam that circulate today. The first is a dystopian narrative that trades in camp images of bloodthirsty horsemen riding out of the desert with a sword in one hand and the Quran in the other, forged against the background of long-standing political conflicts between European powers and their Muslim rivals to the south and to the east. This Orientalist vision depends on an ontological divide between the West and Islam, in which the latter is associated with all those undesirable traits supposedly vanquished by European rationalism and modernity. In this view, Islam is seen as a threat to Western civilization. Is Islam an existential threat to Western civilization? After all, the current jihad seems to be targeting the very concept of the nation state. So is the goal to end Western civilization, to some degree at least, as we know it?
I don't think that jihad is an existential threat to Western civilization. I think actually jihad it's impossible for me to think about it as being anything other than not just a product of Western civilization in material terms. If you think about like the history of these movements and how they've grown under neoliberal auspices, but really at a much deeper level. The baseline assumptions of these movements are themselves wholly kind of, familiar for those of us who are scholars of Western civilization. So whether you look at the ways that kind of the fetishization of the individual and the kind of making the individual the kind of primary social and political actor if you think about like the new visions of community that they're advancing that are totally globalized, that absolutely accept the kind of, logic of globalization, even the movement beyond the nation state, like that's part of Western civilization too. Like that is what corporate power is. That is what the multinational corporation is. That is what super sovereign power, which is the place that we are going to, is. So it's, there's a way in which these are, there's a mirroring effect here, not a negation effect. So that's one of the reasons I think like the Clash of Civilizations framework, it doesn't do us any favors, because it actually obscures the ways in which, these like seemingly exotic, et cetera, like Islamic militant groups share so much of the logic of liberalism and neoliberalism in particular.
You mentioned the Mapping Militant Organizations project at Stanford University. Its research indicates a compelling trend that is stable across many conflict zones, wherein the relative quiet of the 1960s and 1970s gave way in the 1980s to a new wave of militancy by Islamist actors who both supplanted earlier organizations and drastically outnumbered them. The pattern in Pakistan is rather typical. The Balochistan Liberation Front, described as an ethno-nationalist, separatist military organization fighting against the Pakistani government for an independent Balochi state, was superseded in the 1980s by a dizzying assortment of Islamist groups, splinters, and rivals. Why was this a turn towards Islam in politics, a politicization of Islam, if you will? Because this is right around the time of the increased politicization of Christianity here in the United States, and I'm wondering if there's a link there.
I definitely think that there's a link, and the link is, something along these lines, right? That many of the countries where like Islamic militant groups are kind of now operating, they have a shared history as kind of colonial possessions that gained their independence, often in socialist or kind of quasi-socialist revolutions, throughout the mid 20th century. There's this kind of great moment of revolutionary hope that is, within a few decades, though, has been dashed. As each country has its own specificity, of course, but many of them kind of decline into this like period of authoritarian rule, where the promise of the revolution seems to be squandered, and just like we've had like an indigenous elite that has replaced the colonial one, but we're left with a state apparatus that's every bit as coercive. So that's kind of one side. On the other side of it, right, you do have some real advances that happen for things like land reform, for instance, or attempts to build, real like public services, particularly in a place like Egypt, that's associated with this kind of revolutionary period. The pivot toward Islamist politics, is something that both regional actors themselves, like Anwar Sadat and, of course, the United States, embrace as a counterweight to the left. So, remember this in our kind of greater Cold War context. This is the place also to think about American support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, right, as a counterweight to the left, growing out of a really older colonial view of religion as a stabilizing force, as a conservative force, as something that kind of will maintain the status quo, and that can be like unabashedly pro-capital in a way in which these like new socialist revolutionaries surely were not. So I think in accounting for why is there this Islamist pivot, well, there's a few things that are a few interconnected things happening. One is that these groups and organizations are encouraged. They're encouraged by the US, they're encouraged by kind of local powers as a kind of counterweight to the left and as a way of kind of to squash the left. And then certainly since, 1989 and kind of after the fall of the Soviet Union, like the left loses its any patron that it might have within kind of the Middle East, North Africa region. And what are you left with? What is your alternative? What is the one thing that the government cannot outlaw in these states? Religion, Islam in particular, and Islamist politics become a kind of politics in a world where there is no alternative. And I think that it's really kind of important to understand that rise against the kind of gutting of the left that was quite, purposeful throughout the end of the Cold War period.
So why do you think the left was seen as a greater threat than the rise of Islamist militancy and political violence?
Well, I mean, the left obviously is a greater threat to capital, right? Many of these Islamist groups are can fully accommodate themselves to capital. Right. Remember the Taliban in kind of negotiations for various pipelines and such in the 90s, before they were overthrown. Right. You certainly see this with regard to, the nature of governments that are nominally Islamic in the Gulf that are, certainly on board with a kind of capitalist agenda. I think it is when you put religion to instrumental use, you don't actually know what you're going to get. And so if you think about religion as this force that's just going to be conservative and support the status quo, it can do that, but it can also do the opposite. Because again, religion's not just one thing. And the people who practice it are multiple as well. And so I do, this was the subject of my first book, funny, it's kind of all coming back in terms of the way that, British colonial administrators really viewed religion as a stabilizing force, a conservative force in Palestine, were shocked by the ways in which religious, texts, ideologies, and traditions could actually be harnessed to revolutionary mass politics. But it's, so we have, I think the motion here is fundamentally the same in thinking about these forces as conservative, as able to accommodate themselves to the forces of capital. As this counterweight to the left. And they are, by and large, those things. That they might also become militants and attack you, that wasn't in the plan. But again, when you're playing with religion and trying to put it to instrumental uses, you can't really control for what the outcomes are.
We are speaking with historian Suzanne Schneider, author of The Apocalypse and the End of History, Modern Jihad and the Crisis of Liberalism. You can follow Suzanne on Twitter at Suzy_Schneider. That's SUZY. And I am telling you, this is an absolutely mind-blowing book. I really, really was enjoying reading this. You write that change is less an aberration than the norm. Fundamentalists might deny this fact, but I see no reason why scholars need to join their choir. So is fundamentalism legitimized by an analysis that sees it as some older, more authentic kind of Islam? And if so, why don't analysts then offer an analysis that does not legitimize fundamentalism and instead reveals it as something new that is not from the past, but a byproduct of modernity, as you call it? Why not give that analysis?
So yes, I mean, I think you're absolutely accurate on that. Right? Fundamentalism, I write, is this kind of, it's a wholly modern phenomenon. Even the term itself is, dates only from the early 20th century, and it doesn't necessarily map perfectly onto an Islamic context, but certainly, yes, this, we give a lot of kind of credence to these very right-wing and reactionary movements when they are presented as oh, this is how things used to be. And now there are these modernizers and there are these reformers and they want to do something else. But again, just a tiny bit of scratching beneath the surface, we'll find out that the thing that fundamentalists claim is the most essential pure expression of religiosity from time immemorial is itself often no more than a few decades old. I don't know why, honestly, other than kind of supporting, again, some sort of broader clash of civilizations thesis. Particularly mainstream journalists don't do a little more. They're so credulous with these claims often about, the Taliban saying Islam says X, Islam says Y. I honestly thought that Brooklyn Institute needs to offer a writing religion class or something so people who work in these worlds can come and learn how to talk about religions in ways that are they're not just more accurate, but that maybe can also support some better policy outcomes as well.
You write that examining jihad alongside contemporary social and political formations in the West underscores a common nihilist thread, one characterized by the inability to imagine a different sort of life here on Earth. From this perspective, the apocalypse and the end of history appear less like oppositional projects than different symptoms of a common and wholly modern malaise. A nihilist being a person who believes that life is meaningless and rejects all religious and moral principles. How does neoliberalism lead to a globally held belief that life is meaningless?
So, I mean, again, I think there's some different manifestations of this, but like maybe it's worth kind of just saying how I kind of got here. But, thinking, for instance, about the apocalyptic references that really became a key part of the Islamic State's propaganda. Right, that these things were often taken as evidence of some sort of medievalism, some sort of medieval quality. But again, this literature has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. Why is it resurging at this point and not in other points? Why is it that the kind of pursuit of one's own death, which is so theoretically dicey within a kind of traditional religious frame, why has that become something that is so celebrated and glorified here? So I think these are like slightly different instantiations of the same phenomenon, which, yes, is a kind of hollowing out of our vision and our political imagination, our social imagination for what a future might look like. So on the one hand, you have a kind of just, a kind of a nihilist impulse that, yes, that kind of rejects really any possibility of like human life or human flourishing is almost an anathema. And in the Islamic State variety, I think that this is what's behind the apocalyptic turn. It's that the apocalypse is like the safety hatch, the way out, and kind of the seeking of one's own death is the kind of premier form of agency, because you've fundamentally given up on creating a different sort of world. And particularly when the kind of options and the alternatives that you forward that are supposed to kind of create, right, a different social order, the caliphate, et cetera, are still so steeped in neoliberalism's logic. It can't really provide an alternative. What it can provide is yes, again, like an escape route through the elevation of death as the premier form of agency and the kind of and not just, one's own death, but also the death of others. I find it, again, hard to think about that trend within Islam, which is so recent, right? We should just underscore how incredibly recent this is. That, even 40 years ago, this was not a common phenomenon. First suicide bombings are about my age, and I'm only 38, right? This is just a very recent phenomenon that's now been absorbed theologically. What does it mean if we want to put those aside, these kind of instances of nihilist violence in the West, whether they're kind of, mass shootings, et cetera? Where does that actually leave us? And for me, the thing that it points to is, again, this idea of like the human bodies are disposable. We are utterly disposable within this order. Maybe there's some sort of kind of spectacle that one can enact before the end. But there's kind of not much that one can do beyond that. I really believe this is a social symptom of a hollowing out of kind of possibility and a sense of futility. And that it's important to kind of understand nihilism not as just something that kind of like floats in the ether, but as something that might have some sort of material basis as well.
You write that the Islamic State is no way alien to the modern world, but rather exemplifies its rationale. The transformation of jihad over the last century parallels a broader shift away from states as the chief wielders of violence, and that the empowerment of individuals and a wide variety of non-state actors is perfectly compatible with the logic, if not the intent, of neoliberalism. So how much of a threat is neoliberalism to the security of the nation state? Is it a threat to the very nation state it's supposedly trying to reinforce and support and promote?
Yes, I think that neoliberalism, undermines almost like by design, undermines national sovereignty. Right, like people on the left are often accused of this, like, oh, you want like global government or something like this, right? But actually, we already have some version of global government through these, international institutions that are supposed to monitor finance and banking, right? They're like it's like in the world in which Amazon is like a quasi-sovereign power in many places, it's hard for me to think about like the nation state as being the end game here. And that, yes, that is what neoliberalism wants. It wants, the kind of, at least the ability, if not for people to move freely, then certainly for capital to move freely. Right? National boundaries are a thing of the past for multinational kind of corporations, almost by definition. So, I think that this is where neoliberalism, at least, domestically comes, right, comes against these kind of like creatures that it did not necessarily mean to spawn. Right, these kind of far right and reactionary groups who are opposed to, maybe they do have some sort of material or economic base, but they're opposed to kind of the outsourcing of jobs. Their, response broadly to the increased precarity of American workers, so on and so forth, and who will kind of embrace these, very like nationalist solutions to economic management, for instance. Right, that's not what neoliberalism wanted. But the intents and the effects here are not necessarily fully aligned. In the same way that, right, people, I found this very striking during the January 6th insurrection, right, that people would say, people who participate in the march would say, like, if we can't get the state that we need, if we can't get the government that we need through traditional means, then we have to do something else. So it's not that people have given up on the state, or that they don't want anything from the state, or that they're not going to look for the state. They're only going to look to the market to solve their problems. But when the state fails to govern, and it fails to be a kind of a force that can intervene in people's lives in a positive way, that will lead them to entertaining various other options. So yes, maybe the military could rule more efficiently. Maybe a strong man could take over and cut through this kind of this bureaucracy and drain the swamp. To do what? To create a state that delivers for you. Right. And so, again, this is not certainly Hayek and Milton Friedman are not thinking along these lines, but these are the social kind of the fallout and the repercussions of neoliberalism and the kind of selective hollowing out of the state.
So why don't you think they saw that outcome eventually being inevitable? Because it seems like all of their writing and the philosophies of neoliberalism point towards the destruction of the state and the replacement by corporations. So why didn't people like Friedman see that coming?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think right in the world in which Friedman was living, the marketplace would step in, right? With minimal state intervention, what you do is you remove the number of issues that have to be solved politically, as opposed to those that can be solved by the market. And if you believe that the market is this super rational kind of, this super calculator that has way more information, right, than any human being could ever individually have, and thus is far more rational, then it's almost like a quasi-deistic view of the market as a tool for solving, various problems. And again, taking them out of the political realm, right? The goal is that these things are not adjudicated by citizens in a political sphere at all, but that they can just be solved in the marketplace. And I think if you have that view of the market as this, again, like this self-sustaining quasi mythical, almost divine thing that exists outside of sort of like human support or tampering, and we know that is just like a fallacy. But if you have that idea toward the market, then why would you necessarily think that it is going to devolve into something like the Oath Keepers? Right. I think this, all of these assumptions that people had about the functioning of the market under neoliberalism have kind of proven themselves to be fallacies. So I'm not terribly surprised that they also didn't see the, social repercussions down, several decades down the pipeline.
Who knew that the market wasn't benevolent?
Exactly.
I could have swore it was. I thought it was always on our side. You write Islamic reactionary elements find their mirror image in formations closer to home, including a Christian nationalist movement that is, as journalist Catherine Stewart has aptly characterized it, authoritarian, paranoid, and patriarchal at its core. They aren't fighting a cultural war. They're making a direct attack on democracy itself. In your opinion, is the current culture war that we hear talked about on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis, on places like Fox News, is the culture war in the U.S. today a war on democracy itself? And if so, then why doesn't any of the media or the Democratic Party call the current culture war a war on democracy, if that's what it is?
So yes, I mean, yes, I think it is, and in a few different ways. right, on the one hand, it's increasingly, it's a minoritarian like position, right? It's an anti-majoritarian position that's being advanced here, particularly as, and through all sorts of mechanisms, through, of course, like something like the Senate, through gerrymandering at a kind of, state level, and so on and so forth. I think there is a recognition that this is not a program that can be advanced and won democratically in a majoritarian sense. Why is that the case? Well, because the GOP doesn't actually have much other than culture wars. It doesn't govern. It has not governed for a very long time. Again, kind of growing out of that exact neoliberal framework, right? You're supposed to take as many things out of the political field as possible. The market is supposed to solve everything. So you have a real crisis of state capacity. You have a real crisis of governance. But you have, in terms of like, a political platform, something that's not very attractive on a policy basis, right? There's all of these polling about what people actually think, apart from political affiliation, what they actually think about various policy ideas, whether they're infrastructure or kind of climate related, or, decriminalization, whether they're related to, expanded education or healthcare, right? These things are very, very popular with the American people. If you don't want to enact them, if you do not want to, if your kind of chief goal of your party is to serve the needs of capital at a very kind of rarefied level, like, you have to offer something else. Right. So kind of these are, because people often talk about like the good old days where there were like respectable Republicans who, were just like fiscally conservative, but they were socially liberal. Right. But the reality is, because that fiscal agenda is such a loser, it does not serve the needs of the base. You have to offer something else. And culture wars have become that really, really key thing for the GOP. They figured this out over the last several decades, and they're very, very good at it. And it distracts from the fact that they're not able to really govern. So it is anti-democratic in a few different ways, not just because it's anti kind of majoritarian in that pure sense, but because it advances an agenda which is anti-democratic, which is serving the needs of capital above the needs of pretty much everyone else.
You talk about how neoliberalism prioritizes private profits over public good, a process that was born out of colonialism, a process that we often saw in colonial states, colonial rule in Asia, Africa, and South America. So in that sense, are the citizens and residents of the United States now the victims of the same processes that victimize those around the world who have responded with non-state violence? Is the United States, through neoliberalism, no longer occupying foreign lands, but applying that same occupation imperial strategy against its own people? Are we getting a taste of our own medicine, and the reaction is a violent far right?
Yes, I mean, I do generally think that the reason that so much of what we're seeing today, when you think about like the just blind eye toward kind of mass like pollution, or doing away with kind of worker safety regulations, the kind of race to the bottom, like tax incentives like we had here in New York City with Amazon recently, right? These things all have this like strange familiar ring to people like me who are trained as scholars of colonialism in like an earlier period. And I'm like, oh, because that's what's actually happening here, is that the state is just serving as a tool for advancing the interests of capital on the one hand, and preventing any sort of democratic mobilization or resistance to the status quo on the other. And yes, I do think that is one really productive way of understanding neoliberalism, is a attempt to bring that kind of classic colonial relationship between the state and capital, and thinking about the state as chiefly a mechanism for preventing democratic resistance to the rule and interest of capital, of bringing that home and applying it right here. And it doesn't look exactly like it does in various like places in the global South and the kind of colonial or post-colonial world, of course. But yeah, we're beginning to see little bits and pieces of that. And so yes, I do think that is a one way. So I'm not going to say the only way, but certainly one way of understanding neoliberalism is the kind of application of that colonial relationship with capital at its helm back into the very heart of the West.
You also point out that from Hobbes onward, liberal political theory has viewed the two ideas of, now I can't remember what they are, as mutually constitutive, that is the security and sovereignty. The basic premise is that every individual has a natural right to self-defense. The social contract is the mechanism through which people join together to create a civil society, and it requires giving up the natural recourse to violence for the sake of creating a system of law in which all are subject. Protection against violence constitutes the state's basic function and, per Hobbes, the basis of its legitimacy. The sovereign who cannot ensure the security of his subjects likewise has no claims to their obedience. If we only give obedience to a sovereign who can ensure our security, then our security must be the sovereign's top priority. But as Ben Franklin famously said, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So to what extent do we give up our liberties in exchange for security from a sovereign now? Are we no longer paying for security with our obedience alone, but our freedoms as well? Can the sovereign essentially hold us hostage with the threat of insecurity forever?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different ways you could think about this question, right? One is in the kind of, right, the global trend toward, kind of authoritarian capitalist regimes. But that ones that will say, like whether it's Singapore or Saudi Arabia, say, hey, we're going to, you're going to have a fairly comfortable life. You're going to have a fairly comfortable existence, but you're not really allowed to contest this existing regime. So you see, kind of instances like that where I think is very close to what you're talking about, where the sovereign will use the existence of some sort of security as a way of kind of squashing any sort of, potential opposition to their rule. But I think what I would like people to do is to think about that word security in a much more expansive way than is typically done, right? Security is not just your bodily security. And I think that we've seen the failings of this thinking through the war on terror and the ways in which the war on terror and this kind of, this constant quest for security through force has, has helped justify a variety of kind of, not just infringements on civil liberties and at home, we think about, surveillance of Muslim communities or, listening to into your phone calls, all of that jazz. It's kind of well known and documented, but also this incredibly violent regime abroad. Right. We've done war and terror operations in like 85 different countries. How many of those countries really have the legitimacy of their people? How many of those countries are we just propping up state security forces that are already violent and repressive and hoping that somehow by doing so, we will get to this legitimation crisis, which is in fact kind of, powering their fragmentation and the creation of militant alternatives. So I think we have to kind of break out of this thinking. I mean, Hobbes was writing in the 17th century, and I think that the view of what security is needs to be updated and expanded. And when you do that, when you're thinking of security, not just in terms of like, is my body free from harm, right? But can we think about security much more akin to some sort of like real human flourishing? I think it becomes very evident that that is not something that you can gain through coercive measures. It's not something you're going to gain just through, better or more efficient state violence. And we see this both, again, at home and abroad, where every social and political crisis is something that you can just throw, either military or policing or prisons at. Right? These are interconnected phenomenon. We need to think of them as interconnected, but we need to articulate on not just alternative views of what security really is, but also alternative pathways to get there. Ones that do not rest on state violence, but rather on state capacity and reinvestment in places where it's actually needed.
Just two more questions for you, I promise. You write that far too many words have already been uttered in furtherance of deciding whether the Islamic State is really religious or not. Did the group grow out of the inherently violent and fanatical nature of Islam, or was it a consequence of material and political conditions, in this case, the regional instability and power vacuums left in the wake of the disastrous invasion of Iraq? You then quote historian David Cook, writing in his 2005 book, Understanding Jihad, The number of apologists who claim that jihad and terrorist activities carried out by radical Muslims have nothing to do with Islam or are solely the result of poverty or colonialism or other Western evils is still depressingly high. There's no lack of observers who will ask in bewilderment, what was the cause of this? Even as an attacker says that his or her primary motivation stems directly from the Quran. To you, why is an attacker saying, I did this because of Islam, not evidence that the attacker was motivated by their religion?
Oh, well, it's not that I don't think they're motivated by their religion. I think that they've come to experience their religion in this particular way for reasons that are embedded in material conditions, right? Like, again, like if you say, I did this because of the Quran, it's like, okay, well, then why don't we have many instances from all these past centuries of people going in, and attacking people in this way, right? The Quran has been with us for a really long time. So why is it in this moment, over these last, 30, 40 years in particular, that we have such a proliferation of these types of violent attacks? Like, you can't just explain that by saying it's from the Quran, right? What is important here is that there's a network of interpretation, right? That is being activated here. There are militant scholars and communities who draw on the Quran, absolutely, and say, well, actually, this is what is demanded from you at this particular time. And what they're often advancing is something which is kind of quite contrary to the majority opinion of Sunni jurists for centuries. So the idea that jihad is an individual obligation that someone can engage in outside of a framework of a state, right? This idea is no older than, in the 1950s or 1960s. So this isn't just something that comes from the Quran. And the interesting work for scholars is to understand the ways in which these kind of new conditions of interpretation and new interpretive possibilities arise because of modernity, because of its crises, and then they absorb, these traditional texts and canons. So it's not that these, certainly there is a mode of religiosity right now that has this kind of militancy at its core. You can't just explain that, though, by recourse to an Islamic textual tradition that's, several centuries old.
One last question for you, Suzanne. We've been speaking with historian Suzanne Schneider, author of The Apocalypse and the End of History, Modern Jihad and the Crisis of Liberalism. Suzanne is also author of the 2018 book, Mandatory Separation, Religion, Education, and Mass Politics in Palestine. You can follow Suzanne on Twitter at Suzy_Schneider. That's SUZY. One last question for you, Suzanne. And as we do with all of our guests, our final question is the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. You write, far from belonging to a different history, Iraq has been rebuilt as a neoliberal laboratory in which everything is for sale, producing its own gilded class, not of tech entrepreneurs, but of militia leaders and contractors to the U.S. government. The results have been predictable: numerous armed separatist groups vying for power, a government that few trust, a fact that facilitated the Islamic State's rapid spread across Sunni regions, and protesters taking aim at the staggering levels of inequality and ineptitude of the government response. Is not only the U.S., but the entire world's future under neoliberalism Iraq? And has Iraq in any way delegitimized neoliberalism to the elected political leadership in the United States, which seems to embrace neoliberalism in a bipartisan fashion?
No, I don't think that it has. I mean, so yes, I think that, again, part of one of the very dark theses of this book is that this is not, right, jihad is not the past, it's a possible future. And understanding the hypermodernity of it is quite crucial, for that reason. But no, I don't think that anyone has taken that lesson for a lot of reasons, one of them having to do with the fact that we don't tend to think of foreign policy and domestic policy as being linked in any ways, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It's not the way that a lot of our certainly elected politicians, but even policy analysts, tend to think about the ways in which these things are intertwined. But right, obviously, it's the bigger issue is just system preservation. To recognize the disastrous effects of neoliberalism abroad is also to have to reckon with those legacies at home. And that is simply not a project that many people who are elected officials have the stomach and have signed up for.
Well, on that happy note.
Sorry.
It is the question from hell, see? I already hated your answer. Suzanne, I really appreciate you being on the show. I would love to have you back on the show at some other point. We could have talked about this book for 3 hours. I literally had 82 questions written for you, and I think I got through a third of them. So thank you so much for being on our show. I really appreciate you being on.
Thank you so much for having me, Chuck.
Take care.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.